Namaste and welcome to this new episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. I am Ashish Chandorkar, your host for the day. Today's episode is being produced in collaboration with the UK-based organization, Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth. CFOC seeks to strengthen the conservative ties with the Commonwealth to promote and uphold the shared values of democracy. UK and other Commonwealth countries have a large diaspora, and they've all been naturally interested in what's going on in India with respect to the new farm law. The farmer protests in and around Delhi have also been extensively covered in the Western media. So today's episode is an attempt to demystify this issue for our listeners and viewers, not just in India, but also overseas. Our listeners and viewers would want to get a deeper perspective of these reforms and why the protests are happening, and that's what we will deep dive into. And who better to help shape this perspective than Anand Ranganathan? Anand is a professor at the Special Center for Molecular Medicine at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He's also an author, columnist, and rules the Indian television airwaves every night with his 30-second clips. Anand, welcome to Bharatvaarta again. Thank you for making time.
Thanks very much, Ashish. It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Before we start with today's discussion, let me also introduce our friends from the CFOC, Phoebe Sullivan and Sunil Sharma, who join us from the UK. Welcome both, and let me invite Sunil to give a brief overview of the CFOC perspective of this discussion. Sunil?
Thank you, Ashish. I want to start by saying, we look forward to continue to work and speak with Bharatvaarta, who are doing some amazing things. Also, I want to say it's a massive honor to be here with you, Anand Ranganathan. I'm a huge fan of yours and the work you do. And I'm delighted to be here as the COO for the Conservative Friends of the Commonwealth. And we have our fantastic projects manager with us, Phoebe Sullivan. For those who are unaware of our organization, we ultimately work from a grassroots level to parliamentary level to build relationships and links with our Commonwealth partners and ensure the role of the Commonwealth is recognised within Parliament. And of course, the Commonwealth is a vital part of the government's vision for global Britain. And of course, we want India to play a massive role in that. Now, I may be a bit biased being Indian myself. Both my parents were born in India. But that said, we have a shared belief, shared democracy, and there is really an incredible amount of potential that a UK-India strong relationship can have. And this has widely been acknowledged by our government and the Indian government. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. The farmers' protest, listen, it's been a huge topic in India, and it's grown into something even bigger and become a massive talking point across the globe, none more so than the UK. It seems to be official now that the UK Parliament will debate on India's farmers' protest after a petition crossed 100,000 signatories. Few people will, disagree that freedom of speech is important and should be protected, and we have discussions on these subjects. And as an organisation that is supportive of the Commonwealth, we want to learn more about one of our members, and for us to know what is going on in India. We want to keep an open dialogue and an even more open mind. So us at the Conservative Friends of Commonwealth, our stance is a stance where we simply want what's best for all. That said, me personally, I do have a small take on this. Now, part of me, I didn't want to discuss this topic. I felt like discussing this topic almost gives it unnecessary legs and gives it even more attention that, in my opinion, it doesn't necessarily deserve. But I feel now, unless people who are almost against what some of these protests are saying and actually speak out, we risk allow the other side not being heard. And that's why recently I did go on BBC and give my opinion and thoughts. I feel social media has not helped. This is due to a number of reasons, none more so than the left-leaning bias and almost disinformation being spread. If you live in the UK and are on social media, as I am, judging by what we see on there, you would begin to think that India is in disarray. You begin to believe that tractors are blocking the whole of India. You'd be led to believe that the majority of the population hates these bills, hates this government for what they're doing. And this is what in the West we are seeing and facing. And should you almost speak against this, you're almost an enabler. Now, listen, I don't want to go fully into the exact farming bills and legislation. And as I'm really looking forward to hear Ashish and Anand discuss the real details of it. But But to me, the reality of these bills is just about simple economics, nothing else. A bill that allows India to move towards a free market economy, capitalism, a bill that means reducing government power, thus lowering the chances of corruption, a bill that is trying to save ultimately an industry that seems to be dying. Whether we choose to believe this or not, the stats will show that it at least requires some reform. Over 50% of India's workforce works in agriculture, yet it only contributes less than 18% of its economy. There has been an increase in the number of farming suicides over the last 2 decades, of more than 300,000 farmers killing themselves. So I don't believe that people want things to stay the same. And I think social media is falsely portraying and showing UK and Canada and other Western countries that almost every farmer is protesting and angry. Yet I believe the reality is something different, as I'm sure we'll hear later on. I mean, the Congress party, the opposition to the current administration, wanted the exact same bills, and they even put it in their manifesto, from what I understand. So it seems that the party that these people are protesting with, they want to do the exact same thing. So look, to me as an outsider and somebody who is pro-capitalism, I look at this as a fantastic potential policy that enables India to move towards a more prosperous and free market-led economy, which has proven to be successful. Look, I'm sure there's some legitimate arguments and difference in opinions, but I have the sense of feeling that the farming protest is a simple strategy that's been going on for many years, which is this almost anti-India plot, this plot that brings Indians to be at war with each other. And I think there are certain states who contribute more to this than others. And I think they need to almost understand that they are a part of India, and that for them to prosper, they also need to want India to prosper. The destruction of India ultimately leads to destructions of these states. And I think this socialistic ideology, I think history shows its failure. And so seeing India move away, further away, it seems like a progressive move. As Margaret Thatcher once said, the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. Finally, I want to end with British Indians, Canadian Indians, the Indians whose parents, grandparents came to the UK, came to Western countries to almost benefit from laws like the one Modi is introducing in India now. Because at the time, India did not have these kind of bills and laws. So they ultimately left. We came to benefit from capitalism, free market economies, to benefit from smaller governments, less corruption, less government intervention. Yet some of these same people are now complaining, posting anti-India, posting anti-Modi messages on social media. I feel, this is what I'm keen to hear more from you guys, is that they seem to be being manipulated to go against these bills, to go against India, because it seems like the same old message that a small minority wants to do to India. And I repeat, I believe it's a small minority which is to destroy India. Thank you, and I'm really keen now to hear Anand and Ashish speak on this. As ultimately somebody living in the UK, I can't fully endorse or be against any particular bill, but these are some of my initial thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks, Sunil. Anand, let me start the discussion with asking you, what is the background of these farm protests, the overall context of the bills?
Yeah, so I think that was a lovely primer, and the background for the farm protests is basically hatred for Modi. That's, if you want to use 3 words to describe it. Because when these farm bills came on the anvil, every sensible and logical Indian thought that these are great for India and for agriculture. And I'll come in a minute with the data for why it's so good. But we also thought that they are going to be one of the easiest reforms to pull off. And the reason for that is that for a change, all these reforms, including sometimes even the verbatim writing of these reforms, but in the manifestos and the promises of the opposition. Now, what's the difficult reform? I mean, my previous panelist, he mentioned Margaret Thatcher and her iconic quote on socialism. The reforms that she brought about in the 80s, whether you like it or not, were some of the most difficult ones because they were opposed by everyone. So a reform is always to be brought about, but the difficulty or the ease with which it is fructified is dependent upon, of course, politics and whether other people agree with it or not. So most of the reforms that she brought about in the 80s, everyone disagreed with them. So it was very difficult, but she went on, with them. in this case, we thought, well, it's going to be a piece of cake because all the opposition parties, including the Congress, including Aam Aadmi Party, including a lot of other opposition regional parties were for it. And it's not just, their loose comments or off the record or on the record, but they had put it in their manifestos. So, we were all very happy that these reforms are going to be brought about. So to answer your question, before I come to the specifics that I'm sure you'll ask, it was very heartening that at last, finally, at long last, after having criticized Modi for 6-7 years, that where are the reforms, he finally came to reforming this huge sector of our economy that, although it employs almost 44% of our labor force, which is 510 million people. It was 475 million people over the last 4 or 5 years. It's now 510 million Indians are in the active labor force, and 44% of them are involved in agriculture. That contributes to only 12.5 to 13% of our GDP. So it is one of the most unproductive sectors of our economy. And if you look at the developed world, the percentage of the labor force that is in agriculture is always hovering around 2 to 3%. In the middle income economies, it is 3 to 7%. In Italy, in UK, in Europe, it's hardly ever going above 2 to 3%. So here was an amazing opportunity to correct all the wrongs that have plagued this sector since our independence. But when the opposition takes a U-turn, what can you do? You can't do anything. I mean, they're holding the government to ransom. They are ignoring all the laws. Even the Supreme Court has been very disappointing in the way it has dealt with this thing. So, Modi is absolutely not to blame, but I don't know what to do. It's like we've taken forward one step, but we've gone back about 10.
Right. In fact, these laws were passed in June. Well, not laws, but there was an ordinance. So the way it works in India is the government can promulgate an ordinance, which then it has got 6 months to convert into an act. So the ordinance came in June, and there was no opposition then. The bills themselves came to Parliament in September and were passed after a discussion. There was no opposition then. The protests actually started in November. So actually, the laws were already implemented for about 6-7 months before the protests kind of started. So that's the funny part, that a lot of people who suddenly remembered in November that they were against this were actually supporting the same thing in September or as early as June. Yeah. In fact, the current leader of the protests is on record in June saying that my organization has worked for it all my life. That was 6th of June. I think he's changed his mind since then. So, Anand, for the benefit of people who may not know the background, what has changed in the architecture, right? So, what did we have before in agriculture selling, and what do these laws really change?
Yeah, so essentially, I don't know the exact phrase of, the names of the laws. I have it written somewhere, but I don't think that's important. Basically, they're like three reforms. They have been promulgated into laws. One is concerning the APMCs, Agricultural Produce Marketing Committees, through which some of the or most of the agricultural produce used to go, used to be sold. So the government was an arbiter, and the middlemen used to make huge amounts of profit. So a farmer who's producing something just could not sell it to anyone. He had to go through these markets. Now, what the Congress and the opposition wanted before these reforms was to do away with these markets, do away with these APMC. This bill or these reforms do not do that. They just provide the farmer with a choice. You can either go through the mandis, so-called mandis, or you can sell it without going through these mandis. So it's not, it's even, a little bit lower than what the opposition wanted. They wanted to do away with these APMCs. And there are many states that don't have these APMCs. In fact, for a lot of crops, these APMCs do not exist. In a lot of states, the APMCs do not exist, leave alone for some crops or few crops. So that's the first law. The second law was concerning the Essential Commodities Act. Now, this is a relic from the 50s and the 60s. What the government could do was, at any time, it could declare that you cannot hoard, you cannot store any agricultural produce because it was dictating the price of it. And as a result, what would happen was that, farmers, including a lot of go-down owners or private players, would not store the produce because at any time the government could come and actually confiscate it or, put a lock on your go-down. So you could only produce something that you could sell almost immediately, or not. You were not in a position to store something and to be able to sell it in refrigerated godowns after, let's say, 6 months, 7 months. So the farmers were captive to this. Now what has happened is, barring one or two emergency clauses, you could actually, the private players could come in. You would be able to create or make massive godowns, and the farmers could produce their crops all year round with the safe knowledge that the government would not prosecute or jail godown owners, and the godown owners would simply buy, or the farmers could lease out the godowns and store their produce. So this was a fantastic step. This is what all logical, rational people should do. The third reform was, of course, contract farming. That is that you would not lease your land, of course, but you could actually enter into a contract with a private player, and the private player could tell that, look, I'm, this crop, you sell it to me through contract farming on your farm. Now, the first two reforms were wanted by all the opposition, and that was put in their manifestos. The third reform was already being enacted in Congress-ruled states, for last 7-8 years. For example, Punjab already had passed a contract farming law back in 2013, and Captain Amrinder Singh had been following it. So that's the tragedy, that these reforms do not go to the lengths that even what the opposition and the Kisan unions, or the 9 prominent Kisan unions, you mentioned TICAT's union, BKU, but there are a lot of other unions that also wanted these reforms. And these very 3 reforms are the ones that are now being opposed by these people.
Yeah, and so one, especially on the third one on the contract farming, there has been a complaint that the current, there's a flip side. So the complaint is that there is no recourse to, a transaction going wrong. So for example, if a buyer agrees something with the farmer, but the buyer doesn't honor the contract, the farmer may not be able to sue the buyer because the law says that there is no court intervention. You have to go to a SDM, or a subdivisional magistrate, as we call it, right? The flip side of that is that if you go to the courts, then the Indian judicial process can really drag long. So even if you go to the court, it will not help, because the farmer is poor and the farmer doesn't have the means to use the judicial process. So basically, the argument is that neither solution is good. If you go to the SDM, there could be allegations of bribery, or there could be allegations of heavy-handedness, that corporates are being favored. And if you go to the courts, then the process is too long to get justice. So how do you come out of, how do you argue against that kind of a logic, that both options are not valid?
Yeah, no, I think this is just, it's like, catching the tail of the dragon just because you want to do it. For example, number one, the clause was even more draconian in the already enacted contract farming law in Punjab, wherein the farmer could be jailed. Out here, there's no such thing. And to be honest, if we are to complain about any transaction that happens in this country, leave aside agriculture for a moment, anyone who's entered into a contract with a second person, there is Indian law to resolve it, any differences that may occur. Now, the fact of the matter is, the tragedy is that our courts are burdened with almost, how many? 3 crore or 3.5 crore pending cases. 1 crore is 10 million. So it's about 30 million pending cases. In fact, and there are about 50,000 cases that go back as many as I think 30 years. Now, you can't blame a contract farming law when the blame lies elsewhere, which is, the judiciary must act faster, must reform. And, anyone having any disagreement in India is subject to Indian laws and could enter. So I don't think it's a strange thing that, just because the judiciary is slow and it doesn't work and it takes years, you can say, look, this law is not going to work. You can create, and of course, this is something that I do agree that could be tinkered with. You could have special courts, for example, you could, there are always special courts being constituted. For example, for rape as an offense, there have been calls for special courts. There already are special courts. For many offenses, either civil or criminal, there are special courts that are being set up also. This something government could have said, yeah, all right, we hear you. We can constitute, let's say, 200 special courts all over the place, So this is something that was not, I would say, the breaking point, or, or what in science is called the redetermining step. I mean, this is basically, they're just bluffing.
Right. So just as a wider context, what the law is proposing is that, let's say a buyer, which is typically corporate, if they enter in a contract or a transaction with a farmer or a group of farmers, if the farmer reneges on the transaction for whatever reason, the corporate or the buyer will not have much more recourse except getting any money back. I mean, that's the only thing which they can do. They cannot confiscate the farmer's land. They cannot sue them in a criminal way in any case. But on the other hand, in such a transaction, from a farmer's perspective, the prices are guaranteed. So for example, if I say that I'll buy something for 10 rupees from a farmer, I have to pay the 10 rupees, irrespective of whether the price becomes 8 or 12 at the point of the transaction. In fact, if the farmers are smarter, they can actually take the upside, but also cap the downside. So depending on how they negotiate. So although this is built in the law, the challenge is that it's probably, as Anand kind of pointed out, that it's more to kind of overlook the provision so that the protests can be mounted on the back of argument which is not necessarily very logical.
Plus, I think, Ashish, if I may interrupt you, as I said, I took the example of Punjab. I think, as you know, in Maharashtra also, this has been going on since 2006. In fact, Sharad Pawar, who is now opposing these farm laws, was the one who actually brought the contract farming in a big way in Maharashtra. So, you can't, as it says, the saying goes, you can't wake a person who's pretending to be asleep. And the same guys who brought these laws, when for 14, 15 years, these laws are functioning, farmers are entering into contract, and suddenly they renege on their promises, or, they turn a blind eye to what they have themselves been, primary votaries of, and they're functioning. I mean, you can't do anything, And it's really tragic because, as I said, I think India, of course, no politician would like to say this, or maybe even not want to do this, but India must get out en masse from agriculture. It is not a good thing that, half your labor force is involved in something that is so dependent upon or at the mercy of the elements, and that is what leads to so many farmer suicides and crops getting damaged, because the whole architecture, from production to, to selling is almost medieval, as I said, because of these, laws. And we haven't come to the MSPs yet, but I mean, MSP, which is the minimum support price. Sorry, is it minimum support price or maximum support? I think it's minimum support price, right? I'm a bit confused.
Minimum, of course.
Minimum, yes, of course. So, that has been one of the caveats in the whole, the massive cog in the wheel that has been responsible for the drudgery that is agriculture. So, here were a bunch of reforms that were promising to change all that. And of course, Modi would never say that we must get out of agriculture, but left to me, I mean, it's a no-brainer. And why just me? I mean, I'm not a farmer. If you were to listen to farmers, there was a recent survey done pan-India, and 54% of the farmers surveyed, they said, we don't want our second generation to take up farming. So if you're not going to hear to people who are not farmers, fine, but you listen to the farmers. I mean, you get pittance out of the massive amount of hard work and finance that you put into this area. And India also gets only, as I said, 13% of the GDP, so it's just not productive. It's not feasible. And we must get out of it. I'm not even talking about the environmental damage that agriculture and our agricultural practices are doing to, the environment in India, especially Punjab. I'm not even talking about the damage to the water table that our agricultural practices. I'm not even talking about that we need to bring in, GMOs in order to feed ourselves in the next 20, 30 years. We have to look long term. So either which way you look at it, It's a totally unfeasible, unworkable sector. And these reforms could have at least made a bridge, between now and the next 20 years to at least, have farmers supplement their income and be in a position to decide whether they want to get out of it or not.
Right. So, Anand, you mentioned about the minimum support prices, and that's been one of the contentious issues with the farmers arguing that the protesting farmers arguing that the MSP will go away and so on. If you can throw some light on the, how the whole MSP construct came about, what it stands for, and what exactly is the objection there.
Yeah, so so now because all these protesters had to come up with something to hide their hypocrisy, having already wanted and demanded these farm laws, and when people exposed them, they took recourse to this excuse that we want a law which is guaranteeing MSP, minimum support price, that is the government should buy the farmers' produce, and to be ingrained in a law. Now that is so illogical and irrational. I don't know who came up with this strategy, but someone obviously did, and all the parties, hypocritical parties, they caught on to it. The fact of the matter is that if the government were to fix or guarantee an MSP on every or the 23 crops, it would cost the exchequer an amount 16 lakh crores to 20 lakh crores. And just to give you an idea, our annual budgetary allocation, which is the amount the Indian government allocates as budgets to all departments and all sectors, is about 27 to 28 lakh crores. So more than 50% of that would have gone into buying the produce, the government buying the produce, and God knows what it would have done with it. So basically the concept of MSP originated in the 1960s, when we were a food grain scarce nation, not able to feed our own and dependent on these so-called third grade US wheat imports. But with the coming of the Green Revolution, everything changed. But because MSP encourages sanctioned loot, this is what I call it, it has continued, and no politician has the guts, including this government, to discontinue it. Now let me explain in about 7 to 8 to 9 points. Number one, only 6% of the Indian farmers benefit from the MSP. Only 6%. There are about 18 to 20 crore farmers. Only 6% of them benefit from the MSP. So majority of the Indian farmers do not even use the MSP. Number two, the very concept is antithetical to free market and sound economics. I mean, logic tells you that the moment the state decides the MSP or any farm produce, it leads to excessive production of that very produce at the cost of other produce. And this is what has happened. MSP on wheat and rice in Punjab principally has meant that Punjab grows only these grains. The government buys only these grains, and our godowns are brimming with only these grains, brimming and rotting. Up to 30% of them go waste because government procurement is way over its needs that are only for the needs for the governments is for public distribution, to distribute the grain to poor people, PDS as it is called, and maintain a buffer stock. But look at our buffer stock. Our buffer requirement for rice is only 39 million tons, while we have right now stocked our godowns in 2020 with 102 million tons. So we have about 60 to 65 million tons extra the government has, which it doesn't know what to do with it. So obviously it is rotting. Now, number four, with the MSP increasing year on year, because the government has to placate the farmers and political vote banks, private companies actually find it cheaper, believe it or not, to buy these grains from sources other than the state. They even import it from Ukraine. Number five, with increasing MSPs, the cost of every value added along the chain also increases, from seeds to production to retail, leading to tremendous inflation. With no one buying the MSP produce, its quality suffers. The environmental damage for hoarding produce no one wants is immense. Number six, if MSP was to be guaranteed, as I said, for all agricultural produce, the government should be shelling out about 16 to 20 lakh crores of our money. Now, the fact of the matter, Ashish, is that fixing of MSP is archaic and prone to miscalculations because the government fixes it. And Indian Council for Agricultural Research, scientific body, has said that Indian farmers have lost, are you ready for it, 45 lakh crores of rupees due to faulty MSP pricing of their produce in the last 15 years. So here is, this bunch of farmers demanding that the government should guarantee MSP, whereas fact tells them that they have lost 45 lakh crores in the last 50 years because the government has valued their produce wrongly. 62% of all farmers surveyed recently said they want to fix their own price for their own produce. This is what logic should say. Now, if you turn MSP as mandatory for private companies, they'll simply refuse to buy it because it is cheaper to import. Also, why should the state force me to buy something at a price it has set? I mean, are we a communist country? I know there are a lot of communists in India, unfortunately, but this is what it is. Even the state dumps excess produce it has hoarded at a fraction of MSP, thereby garnering huge losses. Now, when it has hoarded 60 million tons, it has to get rid of it. So it is garnering huge losses by selling it. So the irony is, even the government is not able to sell at the MSP. It is selling much below. But who wants to listen to farmers? But the fact is, MSP is a Soviet era legacy where the state decides everything. And for India to not meet the fate of Soviet Union, we must listen to reason and logic and not these Soviet loving sickle ninjas.
Right. So I think communist bashing is Anand's favorite topic. So if I go to that point.
I can't help it.
So just as a background, the MSP came into force, as Anand said, in 1960s because the government wanted the farmers to adopt technology. That was a time when Green Revolution was coming in, and because we were dependent on US mainly for wheat, to change that, the government wanted to bring in reforms in India and to encourage farmers to invest in technology and to modernize their farms. They said that, okay, you make some investment and we will from our side buy your produce at some price. And that's how the genesis of MSP happened for 2 or 3 crops. Yeah. That has expanded to 23 crops from there on. And as like one of the principles of subsidies say that once you start a subsidy, you cannot end it, right? So it just keeps growing. So that 2 or 3 crops has become 23 crops, and now government just keeps buying. And also, most of the time, since government cannot buy all the crops, the MSP is anyway not respected by other buyers, by state governments or by private players. So as such, the genesis itself was negative, and now we've kind of got this into a very big rut. Anand, you mentioned about the environmental damage. I think let's talk about that a little bit, especially on the, maybe you can talk about the cancer train story and what's happening in Punjab because of these measures.
Yes. So what happened after the Green Revolution was that, Punjab became the breadbasket. And of course, the Green Revolution was brought about by Borlaug's scientific achievement, for which he got the Nobel Peace Prize as well, these high-yielding crop varieties. Now, the fact is that because of, Punjab growing so much of rice, huge, water guzzling thing, UP growing and Maharashtra growing so much of sugarcane. Just to give you one example, for example, of sugarcane. Sugarcane takes up 9% of the cultivated area, but 76% of the irrigation water. Now, India is the second largest producer of sugarcane. I think 350 billion tons or billion kilograms, I'm so sorry, of sugarcane is produced by India. The amount of water required is, and I had to, look for this term because I had never before used this term. It's 1 quadrillion liters. So I'm not even, I think after quadrillion comes gazillion, maybe that's a playful phrase, but 1 quadrillion liters of irrigation water, good water, so not sea water, but good river water or some other water, lake water is required to produce this sugarcane that India produces. And what has happened to the sugar prices? They have halved in the last 6 years. So we keep on practicing, these archaic methods. We keep on using, our water table has gone, way beyond what even people expected would happen. The disaster would happen, 5 years ago. So our per capita water consumption is really teetering at, catastrophic levels. And this is going to continue because obviously the farmers, are being placated by the government for, growing all this rice. I already mentioned 60 million tons of the rice that has been procured by the government is rotting in the godown. So that is one huge environmental damage. The other one for which all these so-called woke environmental activists, are completely silent about was that in October, in September or October, an area the size of 17 Delhis. Now, Delhi is 1,400 square kilometers, the area of Delhi. Now, I want you to imagine the area the size of 17 Delhis is on fire 24 hours a day for about 2 weeks. I want this to sink in because of stubble burning. So, this is what is happening to our environment when farmers produce rice, right? They burn the stubble, and it is phenomenal, the amount of environmental damage. And what these farmers wanted was that the Supreme Court mandated punishment for anyone burning the stubble and creating health risks for millions in Delhi and around in North India, because obviously where the fumes go is dependent on the weather pattern. A lot of it comes from Pakistan also, but we shall ignore that for the time being. The farmers wanted the Supreme Court punishment to go, and this was agreed to by all these so-called woke environmentalists. I mean, it's just amazing. I don't know what kind of these environmentalists are who can't even see this, the writing on the wall. So that's number 2, the environmental damage. And the number 3 is that if we keep on growing rice, for example, if we keep on lowering the water table, of course, there is a huge rise in the pests. Because we haven't genetically modified the rice, because that's another area where the environmental activists come in for no rhyme or reason. There is a wonderful variety called the golden rice, which is being grown in Africa, which has high quantities of vitamins, so it can prevent malnutrition. Bangladesh has started on a genetically modified eggplant. All other countries are doing it, but when you talk of the same thing out here, our scientists have made genetically modified mustard. Their fields are burnt. They're like thrown out, and this and that, they're like, vilified. So that's another matter. But the point is that in order to, save your crop from pests, the amount of pesticides that the Punjab farmers are using is just beyond scary. And you mentioned, Ashish, this kind of cancer train. There are many cancer trains that run from Punjab to, for example, Rajasthan, to cancer hospitals, because the farmers, they don't want their crops to be ravaged by, either locusts or all these pests. So they keep on using these pesticides, and as a result, not only the earth has become poisoned, the water has become poisoned, the crops have become poisoned, and the farmers have become, they've contracted cancer. So all these 4 or 5 factors that should be a wake-up call for the environmentalists are being ignored by these so-called, child environmentalists who are with the farmers. What more can one say? This is something which is beyond logic or rational.
Right. So Anand, we've seen that the protests are happening in and around Delhi, majorly from the farmers who are from Punjab and Haryana, and perhaps some from Rajasthan and UP from the northern sides. The protest hasn't really got any great resonance across the country, right? So how do you explain that? What is the rationale of that?
Well, because most of the farmers are for it. This is a classic battle of capitalism against communism. And we know, which ideology wins. We have seen all the nations that, took up communism, what happened to them. And here, all you are doing is providing a choice. And the farmers, as I said, I gave you 62% of the farmers felt that they should dictate the price of their own produce. 48% of the farmers said, we don't want the next generation to take it up. So many percentage of farmers said that, through faulty MSP evaluation, we have lost 45 lakh crores. So here, all Mr. Modi was doing is provide a choice to farmers that you can still go through the middleman, you can still go through APMC. But if you decide not to, here is a choice. But this is what communism is, you see. It's, at the end of it, philosophically, it is denial of choice, denial of freedom to anyone. Now, I ask you, let's leave aside agriculture for a moment. Let's talk of somebody, an entrepreneur wants to start, buys a little plot of land and wants to start farming. And let's say you want to start on a cash crop. Now, the moment you start on a cash crop, are you going to, let's say you produce strawberries or, whatever they do, in Europe or something, you have a choice. You have a choice to sell it directly, to the private players, or you don't. What is so different that India is doing? And, Justin Trudeau, who was for the farmers, this choice exists. He gives the same choice to Canadian farmers. And in fact, he went to the WTO angry that India was, increasing the MSP. So when there is so much hypocrisy, all you know is that they hate India being reformed. They don't want India to be reformed. They don't want India to prosper. There is no other reason but this. I mean, one cannot make anything out of it. This is the only thing.
Right. So, and one last question before I hand it over to Phoebe, but on the protests itself, right? Now, this is the second year running that Indian capital has been blockaded.
Sorry, I forgot to mention one thing where, we must bring in the Supreme Court, although I don't want the rest of you to be charged with contempt, but I have said so many things that, I don't really care anymore. You see, when someone from the government told the Chief Justice of India that only 6% of the farmers avail the MSP, and there are so many people who are for these farm reforms. The Supreme Court said, but where are the petitions from these people who are for these reforms? I mean, this was the first time I had heard that somebody agrees with something, he has to go to the Supreme Court and say, my lord, I agree with this. Look at the ridiculousness of the situation. So, I mean, if let's say 90% of the farmers, about 15 to 16 crore farmers, if they agree with these reforms, they have to march up to the Supreme Court like protesters do. The other side has to march up and say, my lord, we agree with these petitions. So, this is the absurdity that we are dealing with in India right now, that somebody who likes a reform, likes being given a choice, he has to go to the Supreme Court and say, my lord, I agree with this. I love this. First time I'm hearing that, somebody has to go to a court of, no wonder our laws are courts are so slow, because you want even people who like the laws to go and submit a petition.
So, and I mean, that's what I was talking about, that there are already enough people protesting in Delhi and happening for the second year in a row. Last year it happened for another reason, for another legislation. So a slightly different question away from the farming as such, but I mean, what do you make about this style of protests where you are blockading the national capital, you're hurting the companies located in that region, the small farmers themselves are being hurt who farm in Haryana or UP borders. So is this the type of protests we need to live with for years to come? What is the future of protesting in democracies?
Yeah, so I come from JNU. So, you've asked the right person for these protests. And if others do not know, JNU is the bastion of the hard, far left in the Indian universities. But I'm on the other side of the Iron Curtain, I hasten to add. But coming back to these protests, you see, here, Ashish, I apply what I have termed as the Anderson razor, which is that I don't blame Warren Anderson for running away from Bhopal in the wake of the Bhopal gas tragedy. I blame the person who let him run away. You see, because as a crook, it is your almost sacrosanct duty to evade law and run away. So, but, as the government, as the prosecutor, as the keeper of justice and law and order, it is your responsibility to make sure that doesn't happen. Now, if that happened, in the aftermath of the Bhopal gas tragedy, I blame Rajiv Gandhi, to be honest. I don't blame Warren Anderson. It's a crook. I mean, it was, I would have been surprised had he not run away. Likewise, out here, I'm not blaming the protesters, and I'm being a little bit cynical out here, because these guys have no job to do. They are going to be on the streets, and this is how they, they make capital out of it. This is how they become famous. Already there's so many people, and they jump from one protest to another. The Prime Minister coined the word Andolan GV. So they live for all these andolans. Andolans means protest. So this is what they do. But they will block roads. They will not allow others to lead about their lives. In fact, for every day of these protests, the government was losing, or India was losing 3,500 crores, almost $500 million every day. And it has been, it went on for about, I think, 2.5 to 3 months. So you can imagine the amount of loss. So they don't care. But who should care? The government and the Supreme Court should care. You see, who is to maintain the law and order? It is the government and the Supreme Court. Now, before these protests, I would have squarely blamed the government, like I did during the CAA protests, because there also they blocked the main road and they inconvenienced millions, and they let it go on, simmer, and that ultimately, all that simmering, all that pent up, all that anger and phobia and everything led to the to the Delhi riots. In this case, I was blaming the government till the day the Supreme Court came in, and the Supreme Court just allowed these protests to happen. So, I'm not blaming the government anymore for this. I mean, there is someone who's above the government, and that is Supreme Court. The Supreme Court stayed these laws. The Supreme Court allowed these protesters to block highways, 5 highways that connect Delhi from the rest of the country. What can you do? There is nothing above the Supreme Court. I don't think, it makes any sense to go to the United Nations or the, that's the highest body you could go to, So these protesters, they are living a life of luxury, and they are very happy that our government and our Supreme Court has acted in the way it has.
Right. So it looks like we will see many more of these protests for other reforms which are proposed this year, especially privatization and so on. So that this might repeat soon.
Yeah.
Okay. May I invite Phoebe to ask questions from the UK perspective to clear your doubts and anxieties about these reforms or these changes?
Thank you, Ashish, and thank you so much, Anand, for coming on and discussing with us. We really appreciate it. It's an honour. I wanted to shift to the impact that these protests have had in Western media and the response from the West, effectively. And I wanted to get your opinion on Western celebrities like Rihanna or Greta Thunberg becoming so involved.
Yeah, so now, as it turns out, because of the intelligence of Greta Thunberg, she leaked the so-called toolkit, and that toolkit for managing these reforms, the protests around these reforms, mentioned Rihanna in the sense that this is what you have to tweet, this is what you paid for. So these are all paid things, but all the celebrities getting together. In fact, Mia Khalifa also got into this. Environmentalists, a lot of other environmentalists got into this. The so-called toolkit appeared. So this is something that this is anti-India, and I'm all for freedom of speech and expression. In fact, Ashish knows this. I said it on television that I didn't find anything particularly egregious in the toolkit. I mean, it is made by anarchists, and anarchists do this thing for a living. But the fact of the matter is that there were many people who were so-called technocrats in the earlier regime, pre-Modi, who wanted these reforms. So I'm not even talking of politicians. You see, politicians can, of course, make dramatic U-turns, as I think many have in UK as well very recently, and they do in India all the time. But technocrats are supposed to hold true to what they said, because their views are based on a lot of studies that have gone on for decades. They constitute a lot of committees, for example, Swaminathan Committee reforms, farm reforms, so on. So now when they do a U-turn, something is wrong, you see. So that is the tragedy. So, all these protests are completely made up, are to destabilize India. They're nothing to do with farms or agriculture at all.
I want to follow up on what Phoebe said in a question on Western celebrities. I think I know the answer to this, but it'd be good to get your input a bit further. Do you think some of these Western celebrities are helping, in some ways helping because they're being exposed for what they're doing in terms of the anti-India toolkit, or is it just a pure hindrance?
It's an irritant, because you can't control what the other person thinks. There are so many people like that in India, and the mere usage of the word celebrity does imply that you haven't really read through the farm laws, the farm bills, and all. You're there for the taking. Like, somebody bought is a very strong word, but the toolkit did expose a lot of people, and the idea that the toolkit was propagating was that we should, quote unquote, buy, if it not in cash but in kind, all these celebrities to kind of rake up the whole thing. So the celebrities are always going to be there, and this thing about being woke, being communist, being left, is infectious for them, because they know that their ecosystem promotes this. They become famous because of it, and if they criticize the government just for the heck of it, if they hate Modi, then even if it was a legitimate reason for the law to go after them, they can project themselves as innocent, they can play the victim card. And I'm not saying that this is exactly what has happened, but in the last couple of days, I don't know whether you're aware, Ashish, is that there have been a few income tax raids on a few of these celebrities, and each one of them is now playing the victim card. So now the trick is to start hating Modi before the income tax officers raid you, because then you can say, look, I'm being raided because of this. So I mean, this kind of culture goes on, and we know how the Western media is so ridiculously devoid of facts when it comes to India. It's so painting a picture of India which is so removed from reality, and abusing Modi, abusing those from the BJP, giving a free check to people who belong to other ideologies, other religions, that it is so selective, it is completely hopeless. So many in India have learned to ignore it, but of course the real danger remains that people in the West are not that much aware of that, of the selectivity that is going on, so they can get influenced by it. There is no doubt about it. There is no doubt about it. Yeah.
I'll just add a couple of points here. So, we actually did an episode on Bharatvaarta. Actually, we did 2 episodes on Bharatvaarta about how the Western media looks at India. We had Richard Sharma and Vishal Ganeshan, 2 analysts based out of UK and Europe. And they spoke about how what Anand mentioned, that the Western gaze on India tends to be always condescending and generally very negative. So I think I would encourage you to listen to that as a larger context to this point which Anand made. Also, the claims like, I remember reading like 250 million people were protesting. I mean, you can be negative, but you should be logical. I mean, 250 million people is a lot of people, right? Like that's practically every person who lives in the national capital region of Delhi or Mumbai for that matter. So you really cannot have 250 million people on the roads in any practical way.
Yes.
But that's the kind of commentary we've been exposed to. I think one good thing which happened was that some of the celebrities which were used, like the NBA players, I mean, they are not even known in India, and so I'm not sure why. I mean, if they got something out of it, I'm not sure why were they chosen, because they really have no impact on Indian discourse per se. Even Rihanna as such is not really wouldn't be that well known, and so on. So I think that also was not a great choice on the part of the protesters to shortlist celebrities who they chose to deploy.
But had the toolkit not been made public by Greta as she did, we wouldn't have actually known. I'm not talking of the criminality of it. I'm talking of the way they function. It is so methodically organized, every step of the way. And then, of course, I think I was the one to find out that a small wing of the Congress party actually verbatim tweeted what was in the toolkit, what the toolkit asked people to tweet. So that was, in fact, they even had the quotes. They forgot to remove the quotes as well. So, of course it can do damage, but when it was exposed, and, because it was exposed, we now know that this is how they operate. This is their modus operandi.
I'm interested to hear what we're talking about here in terms of media. So in Western media, I think Phoebe will probably agree with me. A lot of our media is more left-leaning, even though the Conservative Party, which we probably call ourselves centre-right, are in power. We see Western media as very left-leaning. If you go on BBC, Sky, the way we're talking like this kind of conversation, you probably wouldn't be on the show. You need to almost believe in these certain social values, and then you can be on the show, and then you can speak. And we're seeing that a lot in Western media. The only sort of the saving grace and the good thing that we've seen is England, the UK as a country, as demonstrated by the election, does not think the same way. So although the media and social media, what we're talking about here is we're definitely in the losing camp, and we're definitely the minority. Definitely in Western culture, we are actually in the majority, as in, it may not show that on social media. Is that similar for India right now? Because in the UK, that's the kind of, me and Phoebe are probably, like I said, the losers in the social media aspect, but more the country would actually probably agree with our sort of ideology and what we're talking about. Is that similar in India's media context right now?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it's even more so. It's multifold so, because I think the constituency that is that is making Modi win again and again, sweeping the floors of states and, general elections twice over, doesn't know, doesn't care about what is happening. This lopsided, selective coverage of India. Nobody would have heard of Rihanna. In fact, later on, maybe a lot of them would know of Mia Khalifa. I don't want to go into the reasons why they would. But the fact of the matter is, this is more like a Twitter. It's almost like a chamber in which, two people are slugging it out. And the Indian electorate really doesn't care. Really doesn't care. But here is the tragedy. You see, the BJP also realizes this. But the fact of the matter is that they're not doing enough to correct this, because it's not that you must completely ignore it. No, because what happens is that Modi can completely ignore it, but then what happens to the other side, the reality, somebody has to fact check, somebody has to give the other side of the story, and that story has to gain traction. That story has to gain traction through an ideological battle, debate, through books that have not been proscribed, that are not being read. So, you would keep on churning the same kind of people, who are going to, spew more and more selectivity. So you're going to, in short, if I need to be crude, you would keep on churning communists, because, you would, if you do not expose the vileness of this ideology, if in books you keep on glorifying mass murderers of yore, how is the common Indian student going to know about these evils? So if you don't know, you keep on professing that. At least give a choice. So I think the BJP is not, of course, worried about the press out here. As far as foreign media is concerned, now that is certainly a double-edged sword, because we know that there are dictatorial countries, and there are many countries that don't have any democracy, and all these so-called beacons of human rights countries, they love to do business with them. UK, USA with Saudi Arabia, a lot of Middle Eastern countries, and China, for example. They don't think of Tiananmen Square when they're doing business with China, do they? So the thing is, I don't think human rights enter into this equation of doing business with countries, but at a more psychological, at a moral level, philosophical level, it does a damage. Because when you, for example, there is this Freedom House report that has just come in the last couple of days. Notwithstanding the fact those blundering idiots have chopped off India, so Jammu and Kashmir doesn't figure into the map at all. Like cut that off. It's like so hopelessly selective. It talks of Muslims being lynched, completely ignoring that so many hate crime Muslim mobs have lynched Hindus, both Dalits and non-Dalits, over the past 2 years. So many instances of hate crimes against Hindus by Muslims. It ignores that. It ignores the rampant selectivity at every angle. And thirdly, when it says that the freedom, the democracy level, or whatever thing it has, bar it has for India, has gone down because of Kashmir, the abrogation of 370. Look at the irony, look at the ignorance of these guys. For 70 years, there was a law, this 370 in Kashmir, that brutally trampled on the human rights of Dalits, of women, of Sikhs, of Gurkhas. Dalits could not get a job other than sweepers. Now, these are so-called the keepers of the flame of human rights. They are supposed to fight for Dalits. But here is an organization that is now decreeing or crying out that you've removed a law that was unfair on Dalits. Can you imagine what is going on? The only explanation is, and Ashish knows this phrase, it's called MDR, Modi derangement syndrome. I mean, these guys have gone completely mad.
I want to follow up on that before passing to Phoebe. In my opinion, what we're seeing a lot in Western media and Western general civilization is it's almost cool, trendy, and woke to be anti-Modi, anti the farming protests, and it shows that we care about the average Indian, the fact that we are for these protests, that we are supporting, that we're liberal people and we actually care about these people, and it seems that is really growing in the UK. There was a protest in London not too long ago that we saw this, and almost attacks towards the Indian High Commission. So we are seeing this rising sentiment, and anyone that almost speaks against this in the West, you're almost seen as enablers and that you're pro a dictatorship, which is the kind of terminology that we're seeing a lot. I wanted to, because we mentioned Punjab, I know Ashish mentioned Punjab, and I want to get your thoughts on this, Anand, on the state of Punjab. We have Scotland in the United Kingdom, who are regularly wanting to leave the United Kingdom, become independent. Now, as much as I disagree with it, and as much as generally the majority of their population disagrees with it also, they still bring this up, and they, you know, they're entitled to, they hold referendums, they talk about this publicly, and you know, this it's on the news, and they give their articulate reasons and their logic. Punjab seems to be very different. They seem to be this age-old battle that's been going on for a long time for them to be independent. Do you think there is a link with these farming protests with Punjab becoming independent, Punjab's Khalistan, all this kind of stuff? Do you think that there is a link there, and this is the root, the actual underlying root? It's not necessarily the farming process, but gives them a reason or a voice to push this agenda.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. You see, because unless now, why is Congress? First of all, there is no doubt that there is a link. So a lot of Khalistani elements are with the farmers against Modi. They are against these reforms, and they are promoting their own nefarious ideology to break up, you know, so Khalistan, you have Khalistani flags, you have a lot of farmers who've driven up their tractors, and the farmers are brandishing all these signature Khalistani, you know, insignia on flags and all that. We've seen that in India. We see much more of it in the protests that are being organized against these farm bills in for example, Toronto or in London, in fact. So there are a lot of Khalistani elements who've entered this. Now, the fact of the matter is that even though that is true, it would be a far stretch for me to say that the Congress has wanted this. You see, the Congress wants to oppose anything that Modi does. So the Congress must now think very hard on the repercussions of it opposing what it wanted. It is opposing Modi for the heck of it, but you know, something that has carried along with it, very worryingly, is this Khalistani, the whole thing. Now, you know, if Congress had any sense, it would really think hard, because you know, nobody wants a breakup of India, and I would say that Congress hates Modi. It would do anything, but I don't think even Congress wants the breakup of India. I mean, that's like, it's so far-fetched that I don't think. I mean, I wouldn't go as far as to say that. Because, I mean, let's put it this way, it has suffered the most, the consequences of Khalistan, you know, as we all know. And India has suffered all through the 80s. In fact, through the 80s, I grew up, you know, while in school and college, and we really thought Punjab is gone. You know, we actually thought, until, you know, KPS Gill came along, and, you know, and then in the 90s were much more mid-90s, you know, the whole Khalistani problem. And most of the people who were for Khalistan actually, you know, ran away from India. They've settled abroad, mostly in Canada, and in some in London as well. So, and they're very prosperous. And one must remember, this Arhatiyas, so-called middlemen, Bicholias, are about 50,000 in number, and they earn thousands of crores. And, you know, they're exceedingly prosperous people. So that is why when they started these protests, they were saying, and they were actually quite correct, they're saying that we are going to carry this on for years, because they actually can. They're not really farmers anymore. You see, they become businessmen, and they have diversified into various streams, and they want this middleman thing to continue. So now, when you have something that is not related to farming at all, you have to bring some other cause to it in order to sustain it. And unfortunately, this Khalistan cause has come in. Now, this cannot be solved, you know, the government by just negating it. There has to be the counter to this, because this can go violent very quickly. We already saw that some Khalistani organization, you know, put a reward for anyone. I don't know, the amount was, Ashish, was it $2,500 or $25,000 for anyone who would hoist a flag, you know, atop Red Fort?
Yeah,
and yeah, 250. Sorry, how much was it?
$250,000.
Yeah, $250,000 for anyone who would climb up this flagpole and hoist a flag. And someone did it. So, this is the kind of goading that is going on from outside, and it is very dangerous because you would always find takers for such, such kind of rewards and awards in India. I don't know how is this to be countered, because right now the government is completely ignoring this kind of aspect that you've said, and I don't think it can afford to. Things will only get worse if it does.
Thank you. I wanted to briefly touch on what part COVID has to play with all of this, if any at all. What are your thoughts on the government receiving criticism for taking advantage of a health crisis to push through reforms without consulting farmers themselves?
No, in fact, that's not true at all. I don't think COVID is linked to this. But as far as, talking to people before formulating these laws, one can actually say that where was the need to bring them through ordinance. But of course, through, during COVID, the government was of the view that you cannot really hold the parliament session. But I mean, that also is debatable. They are holding election rallies and there are millions of people who crowding together. So that excuse is also not there. But the fact is that when all the opposition parties wanted this, right, and all the unions wanted this, when the opposition that is now, but that was in government, constituted committees, high-powered committees of scientists and agricultural scientists and farmers who deliberated for decades and brought out, for example, Swaminathan committee reports, what kind of more discussion do you want? I mean, for example, how can Congress say that we want a discussion on something that we have put in our own manifesto? I mean, that's absurd. That's absurd, because the other fact is that Congress is on record saying that whatever we have put in our manifesto, we have deliberated for years with thousands of people. So it's absurd, that argument. But having said that, as a believer in as much debate as possible, I would have said that this government should not have taken the ordinance route. Possibly debated this, but we know, the amount of abuse it would have garnered, the amount of protest it would have garnered through the same opposition that wanted it.
Right. So that was a very engaging discussion. We probably covered everything with respect to the farm reforms and much more in terms of the opposition and the protests and the media aspect of it, like how it's being handled and how it's being portrayed. I really hope that our listeners and viewers in India, and also those who will be watching it through the CFOC platform, really get a good insight on what's going on and see the other side of it. I mean, we probably read much more on the protests, but I think this
in my time-tested tradition, can I take 30 seconds to? Now, there is one thing that I said during the anti-CAA protests, and that I repeated during these farm protests, is that the first indication of these protests being propaganda, pure propaganda, is the fact that when you arrange a podium or a dais and you bring speakers and you have thousands of people listening to them, if I was, for example, if I or you, Ashish, or anyone, amongst our panelists, were against the CAA, were against these law reforms, and were in charge of, these protests, the first thing I would have done is to bring speakers who were for these reforms, so that the thousands of farmers who are sitting there can hear both sides. Now, the very fact that during these anti-CAA protests, they did not bring people who were for the CAA, during the abrogation of 370 protests, they did not bring people who were for the abrogation. During these farm laws, they did not bring farmers and scientists and politicians who had enacted the same laws, who were for these. That very facet tells you that this is propaganda. Because if you're organizing a protest, any rational person would try and bring the other side so that the current protester is aware of the other side as well and can decide whether he wants to protest anymore or not.
Right. Yeah, I think great point, Anand. The protests have, right, I mean, it's not been a debate, right? It's just been a
debate.
Day one, it has been straight away into and the demand has also been total repeal, total abrogation. Yes. The demand doesn't say that you water down something. They're saying that we just don't want the laws at all. Right. Okay. That was a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Anand, so much for your time, and thank you,
so
Sunil.
much. Thanks, Phoebe. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Sunil. Thanks
you,
for
Anand.
joining us and asking your questions. Until the next time when we have another episode of Bharatvaarta, thank you and Jai Hind.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharatvaarta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharatvaarta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvaarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.